Rain fell over Seattle the way it always did, soft and endless, the kind that never announced itself and never apologized for staying. 41 floors above the street, behind a desk the size of a door, Marcus Delaine sat with a spreadsheet open in front of him that he wasn't reading. He was 42, lean, sharp-jawed, with the kind of tired eyes that no amount of money had ever managed to fix. His company, Delaine Freight Systems, moved cargo across 19 countries and employed more than 6,000 people. Forbes had put him on its cover twice. Business schools taught his routing algorithm, the one he'd built alone in a garage apartment 2 decades earlier, as a case study in disruption. He had built, from nothing, exactly the kind of life the world tells people to want. He hadn't spoken to his mother directly in 11 years. Not because he didn't love her. Because somewhere along the way, love had quietly become a wire transfer, $1,200 a month, automatic, unchanging, sent to an account his older brother Reggie managed on their mother's behalf. Marcus told himself the distance was temporary, that he'd go back once the company stabilized, once the next funding round closed, once the next fire stopped needing to be put out. There was always a next fire. 20 years is a long time to wait on a good moment that never quite arrives. His assistant knocked once and stepped in without waiting, the way she did only when something couldn't wait. "There's a man on the phone," she said. "Otis Pruitt. He says it's about your mother." The name surfaced slowly, like something rising out of dark water. Otis had run the hardware store 2 towns over from where Marcus grew up. A man who'd known Ruth Delaine for 30 years, who'd once sold her a used lawnmower on credit, because she was short that month, and he trusted her word completely. Marcus picked up the phone with a tightness already gathering in his chest. Otis didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Son, I don't know if you have any idea how your mama's living. I told myself for 2 years it wasn't my business. But I saw her yesterday walking to the church food pantry in the cold, wearing a coat that's got more holes than coat left in it. I decided somebody who could actually do something needed to know the truth." "What are you talking about?" Marcus said. "Reggie handles everything. He sends her money every month. I make sure of it." A long silence. Then, "Son, your mother is living in a shed behind the old Delaine property. No heat most days. No running water. I don't know what your brother's been telling you, but whatever it isn't the truth." Marcus sat very still. Outside his window, a container ship moved across the gray water, carrying steel boxes full of things people needed. The exact kind of promise his whole company had been built on, delivered on time, every time, without fail. He thought about the numbers on his screen, and how they measured everything except the one thing that had apparently mattered most. He booked a flight for that afternoon. 3,000 miles away, in a small Georgia town called Willow Creek, Ruth Delaine woke at 5:15 in the morning the way she had every day for 4 years, before the sun, before the birds, before the cold in the walls had softened even slightly. She didn't need an alarm anymore. Her body had simply learned the hour, the way a body learns anything it has no choice but to learn. She rose from a cot in the corner of a one-room structure that had once been a garden shed behind the house she'd raised her sons in, a house that no longer belonged to her. Tin roof, rattling whenever the wind picked up. A single window, cracked diagonally, patched from the inside with packing tape gone yellow with age. A small wood stove in the corner that she fed with kindling she gathered herself, because the propane tank had run dry back in November and there was no money to refill it. No running water. She carried it in buckets from the spigot outside the church, 3/4 of a mile down the road, twice a day, her shoulders bent under the weight the way shoulders bend when carrying has become the only shape a body remembers. Ruth was 71. Her knuckles were swollen with arthritis no doctor had ever properly treated, because doctors cost money she didn't have. She'd raised 2 sons alone after her husband Walter died in a mill accident when Marcus was 9 and Reggie 12. Worked as a seamstress, then a school cafeteria cook, then whatever anyone in town would pay her for once her back gave out. In 71 years, she had never once asked for anything she wasn't willing to earn. She wrapped a thin wool blanket over her nightgown and knelt at the stove, arranging kindling with fingers that ached against the cold, striking a match with the exact pressure that decades of repetition teach a hand without asking permission first. While the fire caught, she thought of her sons, not with bitterness. Ruth didn't have room for bitterness. It took up space she needed for other things, gratitude and prayer, and the quiet architecture of simply getting through another day. She thought of Marcus the way she thought of him every morning. A dull, familiar ache, the kind grief becomes once you've carried it long enough. She kept a photograph of him, torn from a magazine and folded into quarters, tucked in her Bible. Marcus shaking hands with a man in a suit at some conference, smiling the tight, practiced smile of a man who smiled for cameras and almost never for himself. She believed, because Reggie had told her so many times she'd stopped questioning it, that Marcus knew exactly how she lived and had simply chosen this distance. That success did what it does to some men, hollowed them out and filled the space with silence. It was the only story that made sense of 11 years without his voice. It was also entirely a lie. Reggie Delaine was 45, and for 4 years he had been telling his younger brother a story so complete, so carefully maintained, that Marcus never had a single reason to doubt it. Reggie sent real photographs, taken during the rare visits he actually made, staged in front of the old house before it was sold, or later in front of a modest rental property he told Marcus their mother lived in. A place he paid for with Marcus's money for exactly as long as it took to get the pictures, then quietly let go. He forwarded fabricated updates about her health and her contentment. He answered the phone before Ruth ever could, always with some easy excuse. She's resting. She's at church. She doesn't like the phone anymore. He intercepted mail. He controlled the story completely, because controlling the story was the only thing Reggie Delaine had ever fully mastered. The $1,200 a month Marcus wired never once reached their mother. It went into an account Reggie controlled, and from there into a gambling debt that had started small 15 years earlier and grown the way debts grow when a man refuses to look at them directly, and into a second mortgage on a house 2 counties over, into a life Reggie had built for himself on the back of a lie told to a brother and a mother he had quietly, methodically erased from her own comfort. He'd sold the family house 4 years ago, telling Ruth it was underwater on taxes, telling Marcus their mother had asked for something smaller and simpler, closer to church. He moved her into the shed behind the property, which the new owner, an old family friend, let her use out of pity, and told her it was temporary. For years is not temporary. For years is a life. Ruth never called to correct any of it, because Reggie had convinced her, gently, that Marcus was too busy and too important, that troubling him would only make him feel guilty, and that the kindest thing she could do for her successful son was let him believe everything was fine. Ruth, who had spent her whole life protecting her children even when it cost her everything, believed this too, because it fit the shape of every sacrifice she'd ever made. That was the lie holding 2 people apart. It was about to collapse. Marcus's rental sedan, chosen deliberately, plain, nothing that would draw attention, turned off the county highway just after 4 in the afternoon. The trees were the same trees. The mailbox at the end of the drive, dented on one side from a storm 22 years back that Marcus remembered because he'd helped his father straighten it, was still standing, rusted through in places. Everything familiar. Everything wrong. He parked in front of the house that was no longer his mother's, repainted a different color by its new owners, and stood in the yard feeling like a stranger in the one place that had ever truly belonged to him. Dennis Ashworth came out onto the porch, squinting against the light. "You're Ruth's boy," he said. "The one that made it big." Marcus nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Where is she?" Dennis's face softened into something like sorrow. "Back there," he said, pointing past the house toward a gray structure at the tree line, weathered to the color of old bone. "I thought you knew, son. I really did. I thought the money you all sent was going somewhere better than this. I've been meaning to say something for a year now. I just didn't know how." Marcus walked toward the shed the way a man walks toward something he already knows will change him and can't yet see clearly enough to prepare for. The tin roof, patched with flattened cans. A cinderblock step. A clothesline strung between 2 trees, 2 dresses and a nightgown hanging stiff with frost that hadn't fully melted since morning. He knocked on a door that didn't sit right in its frame, that let daylight through the gap along the top. Ruth opened the door wearing a coat over her nightgown, buttons missing and replaced with safety pins, just as Otis had described. She looked at the man on her step for a long moment without recognizing him, because the son who lived in her mind was 22, not a man of 42 with gray at his temples. Then something in the shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the way he leaned slightly forward when he stood, the way he'd stood since he was a boy, reached her before her mind caught up. "Marcus," she whispered. He couldn't speak. He stepped forward and put his arms around her, and she felt smaller than he remembered, thinner, fragile in a way that frightened him more than any hostile acquisition ever had. "Mama," he said, his voice breaking. "What happened to you?" She pulled back and searched his face. "I don't understand," she said. "You know how I live. You send the money. Reggie always said you knew." The sentence landed in him like a blade. Reggie said I knew. Something cold and clear moved through him. Not shock, but understanding arriving all at once, fully formed. 20 years of wire transfers. 20 years of photographs glanced at during board meetings and never questioned. 20 years of trusting his brother because trusting his brother had been easier than facing the guilt of never coming home himself. "I didn't know," he said. "Mama, I swear to you, I didn't know any of this." Her legs seemed to lose their strength, and Marcus caught her, guiding her to the single wooden chair beside the stove, because there was nowhere else to sit. He looked around the space properly for the first time. The cot, the bucket carried from the church, the small shelf holding a Bible and 3 photographs. One of them the torn magazine page folded into quarters. "That's you," she said quietly, following his gaze. "I keep it because it's the only picture I have." Marcus knelt in front of the stove in a suit worth more than the entire structure around him. And for the first time since he was 16, standing at his father's grave, he cried without trying to stop himself. It was 3 days before Marcus was ready to speak to his brother. He spent them in a rented room above the town diner, refusing to leave his mother alone at night, sleeping in a chair beside her cot, feeding the stove when it burned low, driving into town each morning for space heaters, blankets, real food instead of what came from a can. He didn't call his office. He didn't check his phone. For the first time in 2 decades, nothing mattered more than the woman in front of him. On the second night, watching her sleep, he let himself think clearly about the years he'd lost. He thought of his father, Walter, a mill worker who died pulling a co-worker's arm free from a jammed conveyor, crushed doing it. A death that had taught Marcus at 9 years old that the world didn't reward decency, only consumed it and moved on. He thought of his mother taking in sewing to feed 2 boys, of the winter she went without a coat so he could have shoes that fit for school. He thought of the promise he'd made at his father's grave, that he'd build something so large, so secure, that his family would never again live at the mercy of anything. He had built that thing, and somehow, in building it, he had left the one person the promise was for standing alone in the cold. On the 4th morning, Reggie arrived unannounced, having heard from Dennis that Marcus was in town. He stepped out of a truck Marcus now understood, with sick clarity, had been paid for with money meant for their mother's care, and walked toward the shed with the easy confidence of a man who had never once believed the reckoning would actually come. Marcus met him in the yard before he reached the door. "Hey, little brother," Reggie said, trying the smile first, the same smile he'd used his whole life to smooth over every crack he'd made. "I didn't know you were coming. I'd have picked you up." Marcus didn't smile back. "For years, Reggie. She's been out here for years. No heat most of the winter. No water. Wearing a coat closed with safety pins. And you've been cashing my checks and sending me photographs of a house she doesn't even live in anymore." The smile didn't leave his face right away. 30 years of practice had taught him confidence outlasts most confrontations if you simply refuse to blink first. "It's not what it looks like," he started. "It's exactly what it looks like." Marcus's voice, for the first time, went flat and quiet. The voice of a man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and was now spending every ounce of that discipline keeping himself from doing something he couldn't take back. "Where did the money go, Reggie?" "All of it. 20 years of it." Reggie's silence answered more completely than any words could. Marcus watched the confidence drain out of his brother's face piece by piece. Watched him understand there was no version of this conversation where the lie survived contact with the truth standing 3 feet away. "I got into some trouble," Reggie finally said. "A long time ago. It just kept getting bigger. I was going to fix it. I was always going to fix it." Marcus thought about his mother carrying water 3/4 of a mile in the cold. About the safety pins holding her coat shut. About 11 years of silence he'd believed was distance and had actually been theft. "You're going to fix it now," Marcus said. "Starting today." Marcus didn't call the police that afternoon, though his newly retained attorney, Denise Alfred, told him he had every right to. He spent the first day doing the harder thing instead, sitting with his mother, learning the full shape of what 4 years alone had cost her, not just materially, but in the quiet erosion of a woman's belief that she mattered enough to be told the truth. Ruth didn't want her son arrested. "He's still my son," she said plainly, the second night, blanket around her shoulders. "Whatever he did to me, whatever he did to you, some things a mother doesn't get to walk away from just because they were done to her." Marcus respected this, though it cost him something. He worked instead with Alfred on a private accounting. A legal demand that Reggie repay what could be repaid, documented and enforceable, alongside a permanent removal of Reggie from any access to family finances or care decisions involving Ruth. Faced with the alternative of criminal exposure, Reggie signed everything without argument. There is a particular kind of man who is only brave in the absence of consequence, and Reggie had never once, in his life, been that kind of man when a room actually held him accountable. Within a week, Marcus had moved his mother into the nicest hotel within an hour's drive, and began doing something he hadn't done since he was a young man, building his first small business out of a garage apartment, working with his hands, meeting with contractors, learning the details of a project instead of delegating them. He bought 3 acres of higher ground a mile from the old property, with good drainage and a view of the same hills Ruth had looked at her whole life, and started building her a house. Not a mansion. Marcus was careful about that, and it mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully name until his mother, walking the site with him one spring afternoon, put it into words he'd been reaching for. "I don't need something fancy," she said. "I raised 2 boys in 4 rooms and never once felt poor in spirit, only in pocket. I just need to be warm, and I need my son close enough to see him more than once every 11 years. He built her a house with 4 bedrooms, one for her, one that would always stay ready in case Marcus stayed the night, a small sewing room with good light, because Ruth had never stopped loving the work even as her hands ached, and a wide front porch with 2 rocking chairs, because she'd told him once, decades ago, that the thing she missed most about her own mother's house was sitting on a porch in the evening with someone you loved, not needing to say anything at all. He installed a wood stove in the new house too, though it had modern heat already, because Ruth asked for one specifically, said the smell of a real fire reminded her of every good winter of her life. Marcus understood, finally, that comfort isn't always about escaping what shaped you. Sometimes it's about carrying the good parts of it forward on your own terms. While the house was being built, he did something else that surprised even Denise Alfred, who by then had become as much a friend as a lawyer. He began driving the back roads of the county the way Otis Pruitt once delivered hardware on credit to people who were short that month, quietly asking questions. How many other elderly people in Willow Creek were living the way his mother had, dependent on family members who had, over years, stopped being trustworthy. He found more than he expected. An 84-year-old man whose grandson had drained his pension while the old man lived on canned soup and pride. A woman whose daughter had moved out of state and simply stopped calling, leaving her alone in a house with a roof that had been failing for 2 winters. Marcus began quietly funding repairs, insisting his name never appear on any of it. He understood now that dignity is often the first thing poverty takes, and the last thing anyone wants to trade away for help, even help they desperately need. 6 months after the confrontation in the yard, Ruth's new house was finished. Marcus asked if she wanted a small gathering before she moved in. Nothing large, just the handful of people who'd stood by her. Otis Pruitt, Dennis Ashworth, her pastor, a few women she'd sewn dresses for over the decades who'd become, in the absence of family, something like sisters. Ruth said yes, on one condition: hold it on the porch, in the evening, with both rocking chairs already set up, so her first night in the new house would feel exactly like what she'd asked for all along. Ordinary, warm, and no longer alone. The porch light came on just as the sun dropped behind the hills. Otis told the old lawnmower story again, and everyone laughed, and Ruth laughed hardest of all, a sound Marcus realized, sitting beside her, he hadn't heard in longer than he could remember. Later, after the guests had gone and the house had gone quiet, Ruth found Marcus alone on the porch, looking out at the dark hills. She stood beside him a long while before speaking. "I used to think you left because you stopped needing me," she finally said. "That the bigger your life got, the smaller I got in it. I believed that for 11 years, Marcus. I believed it the way you believe something you've grieved so long it stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like the truth. Marcus was quiet a moment. It was never true, he said. Not for one single day. I think I convinced myself sending money was the same as showing up. It let me feel like a good son without doing the hard part. Coming back here, facing what I'd become without you. I built an entire company on the idea that nothing should ever fall through the cracks. And I let the person who mattered most fall through the biggest crack of all, because I was too far away and too comfortable in that distance to look closely enough to catch her. Ruth reached over and took his hand, her rough, arthritic fingers closing around his the way they had when he was small enough to need holding across busy streets. You caught me, she said. Late. But you caught me. That's more than a lot of sons ever do. 1 year later, Marcus stood at the edge of a newly cleared lot 2 miles from his mother's house, watching a construction crew break ground on a project he'd named, over Ruth's mild objection that it was too much. The Delaine Center for Elder Support, subsidized home repair, transportation, financial counseling, and a fraud reporting hotline designed for elderly residents across 3 rural counties who had no easy way to reach the kind of help that had saved Ruth's life. Denise Alford agreed to run its legal aid division. Otis Pruitt, retired now from the hardware store, became its first volunteer coordinator. 30 years of selling nails and fittings to people he'd suspected needed more help than he knew how to give, finally given a way to give it. Ruth cut the ribbon herself, wearing a new wool coat with every button intact, standing beside a son who had learned, in the hardest year of both their lives, that showing up in person is a currency no wire transfer can ever replace. Reggie wasn't there that day. He'd moved out of state, working slowly to repay what he could, calling his mother once a month now. Not through an intermediary, not filtered through anyone's story but his own, still finding his way back to something Marcus wasn't yet sure could be fully rebuilt, but had decided, for his mother's sake, to leave room for. This story is fictional, but the pattern beneath it is lived by real families every day. Elderly parents quietly isolated from the people who love them, not always by cruelty, but by distance, by busyness, by the dangerous comfort of assuming a monthly payment is the same thing as care. Call. Visit. Don't let a comfortable silence become the story someone else gets to tell about your love. If you have an elderly parent, a grandparent, someone who depends on family to relay the truth about how they're really doing, do the uncomfortable thing. Call them directly. Visit if you can. Don't let a comfortable distance become a silence someone else gets to fill on your behalf. Ruth Delaine gave 71 years to people who needed her, and 4 of those years were spent alone in the cold before the truth found its way home. Pay attention to the people who raised you, especially when the story about their comfort comes secondhand. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered a truth about someone you love that changed how you saw your whole family? Or had to make things right after trusting the wrong person with someone's care? I want to hear your story. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder to pick up the phone today. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another story coming soon, and you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. May you always make time for the people who made time for you first.